Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into a pretty huge concept in philosophy, the difference between analytic and synthetic truths. You sent us a bit from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this topic, and it is a lot.
It is super dense, but that's kind of because this distinction is at the heart of how we think about knowledge, truth, and like how language and the world connect, you know? I mean, we're talking about ideas that have shaped Western thought since, like Plato.
So for our listeners who maybe don't have Plato on speed dial, can you break down what this difference actually means? Like, what's the core difference between these two types of truth?
Okay, so think of it this way. Analytic truths are true just because of what the words mean. They're like self-contained truths, true by definition, right? Like a really classic example is all bachelors are unmarried. You don't have to go and like survey every bachelor in the world to know if that's true. The truth's right there in the idea of a bachelor, right?
Yeah, gotcha. So it's like the idea of unmarried is kind of already baked into the idea of bachelor. You
Yeah.
can't even imagine a married bachelor without, like, contradicting the very word.
Exactly. And that's what separates analytic truths from synthetic ones.
Yeah.
Synthetic truths, they depend on something more than just what the words mean. They tell us something about how the world really is, and we got to confirm if they're true through experience. Like all bachelors are happy, that's synthetic. To know if that's true, you'd actually have to go out and, well, talk to some bachelors and see how they feel.
So analytic truths are like those math equations where the answer's already in the problem itself, and synthetic truths are more like you got to get out there and do some experiments to find out.
That's a really good way to put it. And this difference really came into focus with Kant back in the 18th century. He was obsessed with how we can know things about the world that seem both necessary and universal, and he thought this whole analytic synthetic thing was the key to figuring it out.
Yeah, Kant was struggling with this synthetic a priori knowledge thing, knowledge that tells us something about the world, but that we can know without any specific experience.
Right. And Kant thought that some truths in math and science fit this perfectly. Like every event has a cause is synthetic because it says something about how the world works, but it also seems a priori because we don't have to go around looking at every single event to know it has to have a cause.
Okay, now I see how this distinction gets really interesting and maybe even a bit controversial. It raises all these questions about, like, what are the limits of reason, what is experience really, and how much can we really know about the world?
For sure. And this is where another big name philosopher comes in, Gottlob Frege. He kind of picked up where Kant left off and tried to formalize this distinction, especially when it comes to math.
Right, Frege was like the logic master. He wanted to prove that all math truths could come from logic, right?
He did. And that project, which they call logicism, leaned heavily on the idea of analyticity. Frege argued that a lot of math truths that didn't seem like logical truths at first could be changed into them by just swapping synonyms.
So he was trying to find the hidden logical structure beneath the surface of math, kind of.
Exactly. He thought that if we were careful enough with our analysis, we could show that all math truths were ultimately based on the meanings of logical words, like and, or, and not. For him, these logical words were the foundation of analyticity, and they held the key to understanding math.
This is where things start to get kind of mind-bending for me. So Frege, along with philosophers like the logical positivists, thought that analyticity was the basis for all knowledge, not just math.
Yeah. They thought that any statement about the world that made sense could be broken down and connected to sensory experience, with logic holding it all together. They were trying to build this, like, unified theory of knowledge, and analyticity was right at the center of it.
It's like they were trying to build this philosophical tower of knowledge, brick by analytic brick, with logic as the mortar.
That is a great analogy. But just like with any big construction project, cracks started to show up in this grand plan. Even simple ideas turned out to be super hard to define using just sensory experience. Like, what does it even mean to say that a table is solid when we know it's actually mostly empty space because of atoms?
Right, and if it's that hard to analyze these everyday things, it makes you wonder how much we can really trust this analytic synthetic thing to explain all the different ways we know stuff.
You're getting at a really important point in 20th century philosophy. And this is where W.V. Quine comes in, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. He came out swinging against the analytic-synthetic difference, saying it's just blurry and unstable in the end.
Oh yeah, Quine. He's the one who shook things up. I'm curious to hear how he took apart this idea that seems so solid.
Well, he started by going after the logicist idea. He asked if we can really tell the difference between something being analytic and just being super obvious, like take everything as self-identical. It seems like it has to be true, but is that because of what identical means, or is it just a super basic fact about reality? Quine thought the difference might not even be real.
It's like he's pulling the rug out from under this whole idea of building knowledge on analytic truths.
Yeah.
If we can't even be sure what makes something analytic, how can we use it as the foundation for everything else we believe?
Exactly. And Quine's critique goes even deeper. He says that even the simple idea of synonymy, the idea that two words mean the same thing, is messed up.
Wait, so you're saying we can't even be sure that words have stable set meanings? That seems like it could unravel the whole idea of language.
That's the radical part of Quine's view. He said that trying to define synonymy always leads to circularity. We can't explain what it means for two words to mean the same thing without using other tricky words like definition, intention, or possible world.
So we're kind of stuck in this philosophical hall of mirrors. Every time we try to grab onto the meaning of meaning, it just slips away.
That's it. And Quine says this isn't just a weird thing about language, it changes how we think about our minds. He argues if there's no set meaning for our words, then there might not be a set meaning for what we're thinking or feeling either.
Well, Quine's really taken us down the rabbit hole here. He's not just questioning this analytic-synthetic thing. He's challenging how we understand language, meaning, and even our own minds.
He is. And his work has sparked so much debate and still shapes how philosophers think about these basic ideas. But Quine wasn't just about breaking stuff down. He also wanted to explain why we might think some truths are special, why we think they're true just because of what they mean.
Okay, so even if Quine didn't think there was a real difference between analytic and synthetic truths, he still wanted to explain why we might think there is. I'm listening.
Right. Quine, he was great at taking these philosophical ideas apart, but he also wanted to know why we find them so convincing. One thing he did was use his idea of the web of belief.
The web of belief.
Yeah.
I always think of it like this giant web of ideas all connected, like a spider web in our heads.
Yeah, that's a good image. Quine said that our beliefs aren't, separate. They're all connected and they kind of hold each other up. Some beliefs are more important to this web, more central to the structure, and others are more on the edge, more likely to change.
So the ones in the center, those are the ones we don't want to give up, right? The ones that seem the most basic to how we see the world.
Exactly. They're like the core ideas that shape how we think. And Quine thought that being so central is what makes some statements seem analytic. They're so stuck in our thinking that it's super hard to change them, even if we get new evidence.
But wouldn't that make analytic statements sound like any other strong belief?
Yeah.
Like, a conviction or even a dogma?
Yeah. That's kind of what Quine was getting at. He said there's no real difference between an analytic truth and a belief that's just so central, so important that we're probably never going to give it up. For him, it's not about some special meaning. It's just how deep that belief is in our whole system of knowledge.
Okay, I get how that kind of blurs the lines between meaning and facts. He's saying analyticity is more about psychology than logic. But if synonymy, like having the same meaning, is so shaky, how did Quine explain why people agree so easily on some analytic cases like bachelors or unmarried? It feels like there's something more to it than just believing the same thing, right?
You're right, and Quine talked about this, saying these obvious analytic cases use what he called one-criterion concepts where there's just one clear test for whether it applies. With bachelor, it's being an unmarried male. Check those two things, and boom.
So he's saying these analytic statements seem obvious because the rules are so simple and clear?
Yeah, that's the gist. Quine's student, Hilary Putnam, tried to use this to rescue a little bit of analyticity. He said these one-criterion concepts could be a solid base for it, even if Quine was right about meaning being messy.
Sounds like Putnam was trying to find a middle ground, but I bet some philosophers weren't buying it. I mean, even these one-criterion concepts can change, right? Maybe someday bachelor won't just be for men.
You got it. Those were the objections. Critics, like Jerry Fodor, said even these simple rules can be revised, reinterpreted. The whole idea of a criterion might be just as slippery as meaning. What makes a rule decisive can change as we learn more or as society changes.
So even trying to ground analyticity in something concrete like these criteria doesn't really work. Every time we try to nail down analyticity, it slips away. Makes me wonder if we're asking the wrong questions.
It's a good thought. This whole debate shows how philosophers have changed how they think about analyticity and a priori knowledge after Quine's critique. Before, a priori was about knowledge we can justify without experience.
Like we know 2 + 2 = 4 without having to go count apples.
Exactly. But Quine and many after him switched the focus to being unrevisable. It's not about justifying it without experience, but whether any experience could make us change that belief.
So it's one thing to know something without experience, but another to say nothing could ever make us give up that belief.
Right, and this shift towards unrevisability changes how we see analyticity. If analytic statements are just the ones that can't be revised, ever, then it sounds kind of dogmatic, right? Are we saying we'd stick to beliefs no matter what, even if all the evidence says we're wrong?
It does sound stubborn to hold on to a belief when everything points the other way. Wouldn't it be more, I don't know, reasonable to say even analytic truths could change if we realize our concepts are wrong or the world works differently than we thought?
That's a good point. It suggests unrevisability isn't the best way to capture what's special about analyticity. Maybe there's a difference between something being unrevisable in principle and unrevisable based on what we know now, right?
Okay, so maybe unrevisability isn't the answer. But if being central in the web of belief isn't right either, and unrevisability is too strong, how else can we explain why the analytic synthetic thing feels so right? Can we even save it after Quine's attack?
There are a few other things philosophers have tried. One is to focus on the idea of necessity, saying analytic truths show necessary connections between ideas or things in the world.
So instead of words, we're looking for like deep, essential connections between the things those words represent.
Exactly, like take water is H2O. That seems necessarily true, not just a random fact about the world. In every possible world, water just is H2O, right?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine water not being made of those atoms.
Right, and some philosophers say this kind of necessity is what makes something analytic. There's statements that capture these like fundamental, unchangeable connections in reality. They don't just say how things are, but how they have to be.
That's a big claim. But wouldn't Quine have a problem with this too? He'd probably say we're just pushing the problem back a step. How do we tell which necessary truths are analytic and which are just, well, really, really necessary?
Good point. Quine was good at finding holes in these arguments. He might say that water is H2O. Being analytic is no different from saying the Earth has existed for many years is analytic. They both might be necessary, but it's hard to see how the Earth existing is part of the word Earth the same way water's makeup seems part of the word water.
Yeah, the Earth existing just seems like a fact about the universe, not something built into the word Earth. So using necessity, while interesting, doesn't solve the analyticity thing. Any other ideas in this philosophical showdown?
There's one more big one we should talk about, and it looks at the explanatory role of certain beliefs or concepts. This was developed by Paul Horich, and it takes a different angle.
Okay, so instead of looking for a special feature in analytic statements, we're looking at how they work in our whole belief system. Sounds more practical.
That's it. Horich says a statement is analytic because of how it explains other beliefs and concepts. It's like analytic statements are the foundation, the core ideas that help us understand everything else. They might not be super exciting on their own, but they're crucial for why we believe what we believe.
Okay, I need an example.
Oh.
How does this actually work?
Think about all bachelors are unmarried. It's simple, but it explains why we believe other things about bachelors, like why we think they might live alone or go to singles bars.
Oh, it's like this basic belief about bachelors being unmarried is holding together a bunch of other beliefs and expectations we have.
That's the idea. Horwich says we can find analytic beliefs by looking for these basic connections in our beliefs. We find the statements that do the heavy lifting, explaining why we hold other beliefs.
I like that. It's more grounded, more about how we actually think compared to those like abstract definitions. It's like we're looking at how our minds really work. But got to play devil's advocate here. Are there any problems with this explanatory role thing? Seems a little too simple.
Always got to be cautious. No philosophy is perfect, right? One problem for Horwich is that it's hard to know which beliefs are really playing this basic role. Remember Quine's web, where everything's connected. It might be tough to find specific beliefs that are doing the main explanatory work. Any belief could explain others, depending on how we look at it.
I see. So it might not be obvious which beliefs are the real foundation.
Exactly. And that leads to another issue. This approach can make analyticity seem less clear, less obvious than philosophers used to think. We might have to dig deep to find these connections, and even then, we might not be sure we've got the right ones.
So no more easy answers from just thinking in our armchairs. Sounds like we might need help from cognitive science and linguistics to understand how these explanations work.
That's a great point, and it brings us back to the idea that maybe the best way forward is to combine philosophy with science, using things like cognitive science, linguistics, even neuroscience.
Okay, put on my interdisciplinary hat. But before we jump into brain science and language, are there any other ways philosophers have responded to Quine that we should cover?
There are a few more, but they get pretty technical. I think now's a good time to switch gears and look at how these ideas play out when we actually use language. And this is where Noam Chomsky's work becomes really important, the famous linguist.
Ah, the Chomsky connection. Always hear his name. Makes me think of those crazy sentence diagrams from grammar class. Any connection there? Okay, Chomsky. I gotta admit, when I hear his name, I think of those crazy sentence diagrams from back in school. Is that even, like, relevant here?
Well, sentence diagramming isn't really Chomsky's thing, but you're right to be thinking about structure in language. Chomsky's work changed how we think about how language, thought, and the brain all fit together.
So, Chomsky for beginners. What do we need to know about him to understand this whole analytic-synthetic debate?
Okay, so Chomsky says the sentences we say and hear, what he calls the surface structure, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's a lot more happening underneath. A deeper level he calls universal grammar.
Universal grammar. So he's saying there's like a blueprint for language that all humans have no matter what language they actually speak.
That's the main idea. He's saying we're not like blank slates when it comes to language. We're born with a set of rules and principles that kind of guide how we learn and use language. And this universal grammar isn't just some like abstract idea. It's a theory about how the language part of our brains is structured, and it can be tested through research.
Okay, so this isn't just armchair philosophy anymore. We're talking about like brain science and how language really works.
Yeah.
But how does this connect to analytic synthetic? Where does that fit in with this universal grammar thing?
Well, some philosophers have thought that maybe parts of universal grammar, those basic logic and reasoning principles that seem like we're born with, might be where analytic truths come from.
Oh. So the idea is that we just know certain logical relationships from birth, and that's what lets us understand analytic truths.
That's one way to see it. And it's kind of neat, right? It could explain why analytic truths seem so convincing to everyone, in every language, in any possible world. If they're part of how our minds are built, their truth wouldn't depend on anything about the world or history.
But isn't that like that Neo-Cartesianism stuff, appealing to some mysterious, like, inborn thing we can't really explain or see? Didn't we already try that and hit a wall?
Good point, but there's a key difference. Chomsky's universal grammar isn't just some vague idea about intuition. It's a specific, testable idea about the language faculty. It's based on tons of research on how kids learn language, how we process it, and what's happening in our brains when we use language.
So we're not just taking Chomsky's word for it. We've got actual science backing up this idea that something special happens in our brains with language. But has anyone actually found that analytic truths are, like, processed differently in the brain? Is there some kind of brain signature for them?
That's the big question, and researchers in psycholinguistics and neuroscience are looking into it. Some studies have found that people process analytic sentences faster and easier than synthetic ones, suggesting that our brains might have a shortcut for these, like, self-evident truths.
So our brains might be built to recognize and use analytic truths quickly. That would make sense, wouldn't it? If we could just grasp these basic truths without always having to check them against reality, that would be super efficient.
It would, but it's not that simple. Other studies haven't been so clear-cut. It might be that how our brains handle these sentences depends on lots of things, like how complex the sentence is, the context, what the person already knows, and how well they think.
So, like most things in science, it's complicated. But even if we could find a specific brain pattern for analyticity, does that really answer the philosophy question?
That's a really good question, and it gets at what philosophy can and can't tell us. Even if we had a perfect map of the brain, it wouldn't answer those big questions about truth, knowledge, and meaning. Neuroscience can show us how the brain works, but it can't tell us why it works that way or what it means for how language, thought, and reality connect.
Right. A brain scan can't tell us if all bachelors are unmarried is true because of what the words mean or because of some fundamental fact about the universe. Those are philosophical questions that we got to tackle with logic and argumentation, right?
Exactly. Science gives us awesome data about how our minds work, but it's up to us as philosophers to figure out what that data means for big questions about knowledge, truth, and what it means to be human.
Wow. Feels like we've come full circle in this deep dive. We started with philosophers just thinking about analyticity, then we went through the web of belief, explored necessity, and even peeked into how the brain handles language. Quite a journey.
It has been. And I think it shows how important it is to combine different fields, like philosophy and science, to understand these basic questions about ourselves and the world.
Well, maybe we haven't completely solved the mystery of analytic synthetic, but we definitely explored some really interesting ideas. We questioned what we thought we knew, grappled with complex stuff, and maybe even learned a little about language and thought. Isn't that what a good deep dive should do?
Absolutely. It's not always about finding the right answers, but about getting curious, thinking critically, and leaving with a deeper understanding of how complex the world is.
So to all our listeners out there, keep thinking about those philosophical questions. Remember, knowledge is power, and now you've got a little more of it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the analytic-synthetic distinction. Until next time, keep exploring and keep wondering.